classic Trump fashion, after making a bigger-than-life proclamation that American troops in Syria would be withdrawn as soon as possible, the U.S. president has had to walk back that decision under pressure from within and outside the United States. While its presence in Syria is undoubtedly illegal, the U.S. presence there gives some comfort to allies who have worked so hard to fund, arm, and motivate a slew of extremist terror groups who have failed to overthrow the Damascus government. Join me, Waqar Azouz, as we seek to understand the controversy over the U.S. role in Syria and its future. Let's firstly go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by our correspondent, Colin Campbell. Colin, this has certainly been a confusing time vis-a-vis understanding what the American policy towards Syria is. What have you learned about that?
Well, it's confusing for a lot of people. Of course, we heard President Trump condemning President Obama for the U.S. role in Syria, saying that there shouldn't be a timeline for the wind down, and that would give the enemies of the U.S. further time to stand down, to relax, and then really try to escalate their attacks after troops started to withdraw. Well, here we have President Trump doing the same thing, saying that he'd like to see a troop drawdown in about 6 months, giving his advisors and giving his generals that timeline. Of course, this is not under a lot of controversy, as a lot of his advisors are saying that, listen, if you do pull out from Syria, then there will be a vacuum of U.S. presence there. That will allow other countries to have more of an influence. But President Trump argues back, saying that the U.S. is not getting anything out of its presence in Syria. And I think that's part of the consternation there. As he looks at the hundreds of millions of dollars that the U.S. is spending in Syria, he's wondering what the U.S. gets out of it. And his advisors are saying that the U.S. needs to be there to have some type of presence so that other countries won't come in and control that region counter to U.S. security interests.
Very well, Colin, we'll leave there at that, but of course, as always, we appreciate your reporting for us. Well, our guest for tonight's discussion, our award-winning journalist, Mr. Martin Jay, who is joining us live from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And we're also joined by writer and lecturer, Mr. Jonathan Pryor, who is joining us live from London. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Jonathan, I'll start with you. What do you make of Trump seemingly, at least, walking back his demand that the American military has to leave Syria within 6 months?
Well, he's clearly given way to pressure from within the administration. It would have been wonderful to be a fly on the wall of the White House on Tuesday when the National Security Council met, because the president apparently went into that meeting determined to pull out the 2,000 or so US troops from Syria, and he was told very firmly by his defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that that would be disastrous. And what they seem to have done is to come to a sort of compromise so that Mr. Trump won't get what he wanted originally, which was a pullout straight away, but it will not be an indefinite US presence. They're talking now of about 6 months, which is not an accidental figure, because basically Mr. Trump would like to be able to say, when the November congressional elections come up in November, you see, I've done what I said during my election campaign. I pulled US troops out of Syria.
Martin, what do you make of all this? Because, you know, it's been a confusing time, hasn't it, to be trying to understand what America's policy under Trump is towards Syria?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a great deal of confusion, and I think it's rather alarming, the extent, the sheer volume of Trump's ignorance of the region and Syria. I think that's one thing that comes through. Jonathan's absolutely right in London. You know, I think the generals put him straight on exactly what the situation was there on the ground, but it's kind of worrying that Trump is in a position to make these incredibly important decisions around the world and doesn't really seem to understand really anything outside of Washington. But I think there's a great deal of confusion and tail chasing going on. I don't think there's really any real end game with Trump in Syria. I think you know, he just had a spasm where he wanted us to deliver a message to a number of people all at the same time, including the Saudis and the Emiratis in the Middle East, that he's really not happy about the situation that he's got himself in. You know, for Trump, for when he looks at Syria, he doesn't see public relations collateral that he can capitalize on. He doesn't see political capital. I mean, he doesn't see cash or any more arms deals. And I think that really embarrassing, cringing moment where Mohammed bin Salman was in Washington and Trump presented those huge cards, like storyboard cards with pointers on them about how much money that Trump was hoping the Saudis would spend on that particular trip. I think that that was a sort of coded message that he's also not particularly happy with the arrangement with Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. You know, he's clearly made it. He's made it clear. He's gone on the record. The Americans' own military magazine, Stars and Stripes, wrote an article which I thought was quite interesting, which got picked up by very, very fringe and exclusive media outlets around the world, whereby they claimed from sources that Trump had asked the Saudis back in December of last year for a $4 billion cash payout. And I think that gives you an indication, a glimpse of how Trump sees his own situation and America in Syria. You know, if at the end of the day there's nothing really there to capitalize on, at least can we somehow extrapolate cash from our main partners in the Middle East? And I don't think they've paid it, and I think this is really what the problem is. You know, so he had this sort of spasm, and he managed to deliver a message to everybody at the same time, but you know, he's not aware. Trump just doesn't know the hand-in-glove relationship that Israel at the moment has with the Pentagon. You know, he's unaware of so many things on the ground which are just beyond his reach. So I think a great deal of confusion, but I don't really see American pulling out of Syria even in 6 months' time. I think there's a great deal of smoke and mirrors for the camera at the moment. It seems like shooting himself in both feet, you know, for America to actually pull out of Syria and lose all the capital, and not just allow the possibility of a vacuum being filled by ISIS, but also the implications towards America's greatest enemy in the region, which is Iran, you know, filling that
Right.
hole as well.
Jonathan, what do you make of that? Do you agree with Martin? Because, you know, certainly Trump did come out and essentially say that he wanted money if, you know, others wanted America to remain in Syria. Is this just about money, really?
Well, I agree with Martin. It is largely about money. Obviously, it's never totally about money. But we have to remember that Donald Trump is essentially a businessman who's got into politics almost as a hobby and suddenly found himself in the White House. It was interesting watching a broadcast that he made on Tuesday evening, when basically he was saying America has poured $7 trillion into the Middle East over the last 17 years and got nothing in return. And it was like, that was a businessman talking. Basically, you know, we opened franchises in a different part of the world and it hasn't worked, so that's why we should withdraw it. I have to say, of course, independent experts believe that $7 trillion figure is an overestimate. It's probably about half that amount. But certainly money is important. And Martin's absolutely right to draw attention to the Saudi connection, because Trump has made no secret of the fact that he wants the Saudis to pick up a large amount of the bill if any US troops are going to remain.
And so do you think, Jonathan, that the Saudis, Emiratis are willing to do that?
To a certain extent, I think there will be. Obviously, there's, although Saudi Arabia has these huge oil reserves, it doesn't have a totally bottomless pot of money, and therefore it can't continue to splash out for too long. But particularly given its very heavy engagement in Yemen, nonetheless, Saudi believes that it does have certain tactical interests in having a finger in the pie in Syria, if you like, simply because of that rivalry with Iran and the fears that have been expressed in Riyadh, the Saudi capital, as well as in some Western capitals, that if the Americans withdraw, not only could we possibly see a resurgence of ISIS or Daesh in the pockets that it still has in the Euphrates basin, but more importantly, as it's seen from Riyadh, it would open the way for the triumvirate, if you like, of Iran, Turkey and Russia to extend what is seen as their influence in Syria.
All right, so Martin, you know, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about that the trio, the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians, because, you know, we recently had that meeting in Ankara as well. Is this essentially the Americans, or the American establishment, really, looking at this as Trump really just speaking out mistakenly, and him essentially having egg on his face right now at the moment, because it seems like, you know, even American officials, the moment he came out and said we're going to walk out of Syria, American officials were already essentially saying that no, that's not going to happen. Do you think the U.S. establishment has already made the decision that no, we need to counter this trio?
Yeah, exactly. I think the decision and the actual mechanics behind it is so much bigger than Trump, and I think that's the problem that Trump has, as he realizes that the only way, the only possible chance he has of getting leverage in any of these huge decisions is to go sensational, is to make these ridiculous statements which gains the media attention so quickly and allows him for a brief moment to have the spotlight thrown on him, where he seems to be the chief antagonist of new media coverage, new stories popping up on the front pages of newspapers and leading news bulletins. But I think we should be getting used to this. You know, it's been a long time now. He just constantly does this. He just throws things up in the air. He says 1 minute we'll have new trade tariffs on aluminium and steel to the Europeans, and then a week later, you know, it's forgotten. 1 minute he's talking about possibly bombing North Korea, and you know, and a week later we hear nothing of it. And I think we should get used to this capricious and rather juvenile way of manipulating media. And I think journalists, to some extent in America, should be more responsible. You know, but you talk about egg on the face of Trump. Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think he's worried about more egg on his face. I think he's got two huge issues coming up in the next few weeks and months. Certainly the North Korea issue, that he cannot walk away as a loser, because that will have a huge impact back home on his own political capital. But also in the middle of May, don't forget, he said over and over again that he's going to pull out of the so-called Iran nuclear deal. Now, if he does that, of course, the implications in the region and also the relations between America and the European Union, you know, are going to be put on a whole new dynamic. I mean, it's not even worth thinking about. I don't wonder if he really knows what he's doing. Let's hope that that same machinery, that same infrastructure at the White House and at the State Department and the Pentagon will be able to do what they've done just recently and actually, you know, install some sobriety and common sense into these two issues that are coming up. Because his real problem is that he can't afford to fail on even either one of those two issues. He's thinking about his own media campaign, his own popularity, and so I think, you know, internationally in the Middle East, he needs a victory. He needs something that he can actually say, look, I've done this. Whether it's I've defeated ISIS or whether I've made a big stand against Iran in the region, but it's not happening, and I think he's starting to panic. And what we're seeing now are the early stages of him breaking into a sweat.
All right, so Jonathan, let's for a moment then specifically look at the U.S. role in Syria itself, because, you know, the trio that I mentioned before, and you mentioned as well the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians, would argue, obviously, that they're being able to accomplish a lot through their Astana peace process, and now the summit that they had in Ankara recently, and in Sochi earlier before that, than the Americans have ever been able to in this fight against Daesh, et cetera, et cetera. Would it be a good thing, do you think, Jonathan, for the Americans to, in fact, leave Syria?
Well, obviously, from the point of view of the Syrian government, it would be a very welcome development if the Americans leave. One complicated matter, though, is that the Americans in particular have been helping Kurdish groups in the north of Syria, some of whom now are in direct conflict with Turkish forces. And this really is a complication which has not received really proper due attention in much of the Western media so far. But it's potentially very awkward indeed, given that Turkey is one of the three countries involved in the Astana process, if we can call it that. So yes, from Damascus's point of view, it would be great if the Americans left. But I agree with Martin that there will be voices in the White House, and particularly John Bolton, when he comes, if he's approved and he comes into the office, then it's going to be much more hardline and perhaps more realistic, if we, in inverted commas, than Mr. Trump's rather simplistic view of the world. And I'm glad that the Iran nuclear deal was mentioned, because here in Europe this is something we care about passionately. Britain is traditionally a very strong ally of the United States, but has made no secret whatsoever that the government in London, and indeed the opposition parties, really want the Iran nuclear deal to succeed. It's worked well. Iran has complied with what it was asked to do, and we see the threat that Mr. Trump is making to that deal as very serious indeed for the whole of the international order of things.
All right, so Martin, what do you make then of the American track record in Syria? You know, the Americans, obviously, many American officials like to take credit for the defeat of Daesh, but then, you know, on the other side, many people can argue that, listen, it was America's own actions in Iraq, for example, that gave rise to Daesh. At the very least, it was America's own allies who funded, armed, you know, even motivated, really, Daesh as well. So what's America's track record, do you think, in Syria, and does that then mean it should really walk away?
It's comical and really very confusing, and unfortunately, very sadly, you know, because of sloppy journalism, because of partisan journalism that we're seeing on the increase now, people around the world don't really understand the nuances of the Syrian war. They don't really understand that, you know, it was America's failed policy in Iraq which effectively helped Daesh to spread so rapidly, so quickly across the region. You know, and we're seeing these same kind of blinded dogma day in, day out. Almost everything that America and its Gulf Arab partners in the region does in a response to a so-called threat of Iran's hegemony in the region is a disaster. It's always backfired. Everything they do just backfires. Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, you know, wherever the Americans try and intervene and try and make a statement against Iran and Iran's partners in the region, you know, it's always this reaction. And what we're living with now is the reality in Syria of confused American policy. You've got generals on one side of the Pentagon that believe the Americans should be there because of Iran and Iran's allies in the region, and another group of generals who believe that it really should be all about keeping Daesh in check, because let's not forget, they may have nailed ISIS in Syria. There are only little small pockets all around the country which are still holding out, but across the border in Iraq there are now credible reports from very high caliber journalists that I follow every day who are saying that Daesh is reforming in Iraq. You know, you've got a lot of sleeper cells in a lot of these Iraqi towns where once the Iraqi military moves out, Daesh comes back and starts to take pocket by pocket, and I think this is a real problem. So we've got a lot of confusion on the American side in Syria. You know, it's never reported in American newspapers how many of the significant battles in Syria where Daesh were crushed by Iranian or by Hezbollah forces. You know, this is never reported on, and it was the same in Iraq. You know, in the early days of Fallujah and Ramaldi, and it was always the Iranian militias that went in first and did all the hard work. And so you have this kind of this irony, this complete confusion, where America is supposedly going in to crush Daesh across the region, but in fact it was if the Iranians would have had better support and better communication with America, you know, the job could have been done a lot better. You know, both seems to be a sort of dichotomy of logic, and you know, there's a lot of confusion, and no one really can see America having an end game, because I don't believe it really wants to crush Daesh. I don't believe that there is a real sincere intention to completely destroy ISIS. I think it was always very much a pretext to be in the region to destabilize the Assad regime and to hit Iran. And I think that is still very much the case now. I think the real reason that Americans will stay there won't be anything to do with ISIS. It'll be to do with Assad and the Iranians. And I think in the coming months we're going to see Pompeo and Bolton making a very strong case to Trump. Look, you can't pull out of Syria, because Syria is the only place on the whole planet where we have the slightest opportunity to have a manageable small conflict with the Iranians and Iranian proxies. So I think that'll come up in the future, and we'll have to wait and see how far Trump will dig his heels in.
As Jonathan, you know, earlier we were talking about being a fly on the wall in that meeting with Trump and his generals, but, you know, we're hearing reports, of course, also about that phone call between Trump and Netanyahu, which was apparently very tense, with the Israelis not happy, of course, about any possibility even of the Americans withdrawing from Syria. And in that call, apparently Netanyahu said if the United States were to withdraw, it would, quote, allow Israel's enemies to gain a further foothold in a neighboring country, end quote. That, of course, directed quite obviously at the Islamic Republic of Iran. What do you make of that, Jonathan? How important a role do you think the Israelis have had in pressuring possibly not even just Trump, but the generals and others into you know, making Trump reconsider his decision?
Well, I think over the last few days, Israel has been putting a great deal of pressure on, and despite the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure himself domestically, with various charges looming over him, nonetheless, the Israelis would be appalled if the US completely withdraws from Syria at this stage. And Israel, I fear, would probably then try to take a more assertive role over the Syrian airspace in what it would claim would be the defense of its own interests. So that is rather an alarming prospect. But Israel has a huge number of friends in the US Congress as well as in the US administration, and therefore I think their very heavy lobbying that's been going on may well indeed, as Martin suggests, mean that the US troops do stay longer because Trump will be told that, well, hang on, this is really not in the interests of the West. If we assume that the interests of the West are to back the Saudis in the regional hegemonic standoff with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
All right, so Martin, I'll give you the final word. We have about a minute and a half left. So I wanted to know then, Martin, going forward then, how do the Americans then justify staying in Syria? Because, you know, we can obviously put doubt on the Daesh rule, the fight against Daesh, as you well put it in your previous answer. So how will the Americans justify long-term remaining in Syria?
I don't know. I just don't know how they will. I don't know how they'll sell that back home. I think that'll be it'll be an internal thing between Trump and the hawks that he's surrounding himself by. You know, I think what we've got here is we've got a new situation evolving where we're actually witnessing, we're seeing for ourselves now the lack of vigor, the lack of stamina that Trump has in the region. He just doesn't have the courage, the balls, you know, to really engage American soldiers in the region. I think it was very interesting that just a few days ago there were the reports of American soldiers that had died in Manbij, and I think that may well have been the spark which pushed Trump over the edge, where he had this tantrum and said, look, we've got to get out of Syria. But to actually justify being in the region, I think it'll be a very highbrow thing to the analysts, to the think tanks and to the generals in DC, that look, maybe we need to be there just for one thing only, which is to actually prevent a corridor opening from one side of the country, starting in Tehran and stretching right across from east to west of Syria and ending up in Lebanon. At the moment, the Americans have got two huge military bases, one very close to Raqqa, another one at Al-Tanf, very close to the Iraqi border, and they sort of they prevent this corridor opening up. And I think that's probably that's something that the military establishment will be very keen to make sure stays.
All right, we'll leave it there at that, gentlemen. But of course, we do appreciate both your contributions to tonight's discussion. That was Mr. Martin Jay speaking to us live from Beirut, and he's an award-winning journalist. And we're also joined by Mr. Jonathan Fryer, who is speaking to us live from London, and he is a writer and lecturer. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.